Hello, coaches. Welcome back to another episode of Coach Better Spotlight. Today, I am chatting with Ken Shelton, who is currently working with schools around the world on technology, equity, and inclusion. Ken's extensive background with many different school communities provides lots of insight for those of us working towards social justice, and in particular through the lens of technology for equity. This Spotlight episode focuses on the ways that we, as coaches, can support teachers and leaders in understanding why social justice work is so essential in every subject area, as well as the ways that technology can support that vision. In the full-length audio podcast, we discuss in depth a wide variety of issues, particularly relevant to international schools, in terms of coaching for social justice and tech equity. To hear the full episode, subscribe to Coach Better wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy today's episode, you will love all of the resources and professional learning experiences we're curating for you here at Eduro Learning. Check out our website to see all of our latest offerings at edurolearning.com. Welcome back to another episode of Coach Better. I am super excited to be here with Ken. Thank you so much, Ken Shelton, for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you. This is wonderful. You should tell everyone that we had to arrange our time schedule so that it works for you, works for me, not too early for you, not too late for me.
That's right, because we're operating from multiple continents here. So Asia and the US is usually not a convenient time zone, but we made it work. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Can you start us off by telling us a little bit about your past work as an educator? Like, give us a bit of an intro into your teaching experience, and then we'll talk about what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. So I spent most of my teaching career in the Los Angeles Unified School District. I was a classroom teacher, a full-time classroom teacher for just right around 18 years. And then prior to that, I was a substitute teacher. Early in my career, I taught English and then social studies. And then my last 11 years in the classroom, I taught in a technology lab. So my certifications here in California are in English, social studies, and then also career and technical education. So I'm a big advocate within the CTE world as well. And then after leaving the classroom, which is I would say for your listeners, it's a cautionary tale that I will say that, which is kind of ties in with some of what we're going to chat about. For my entire 18-year career in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and I do want to stress Los Angeles, I was the only black male teacher at every school that I worked at. So that was 18 years of a lot of feelings of inadequacy, isolation, gaslighting, and many other things where I was subjected to a constant barrage of microaggressions that ultimately, which I'm a big advocate for destigmatizing the mental health. Ultimately, I ended up leaving the classroom and going out on illness leave and then taking antidepressants for 2 years. So I left the classroom, and then I had the opportunity to essentially grow my impact and my reach by working both nationally and internationally, giving talks, doing trainings, doing workshops. A lot of it has been around my connections with Google and Apple, at least early on, but lately it's just if there's a value of what I have to offer and support educators, then that's where I go. That's where I want to be. And I will say for your listeners, it probably has taken me the better part of the last 20 years or so to really hone in on what my mission, passion, and purpose are. And I have found the synergy between all three of those. And so that's what I do now. So those are some things that I know you didn't know that I'm glad you asked the question so that I could share those with you. And again, there's two areas that I really want to destigmatize is the mental health aspect, which I think a lot of teachers need support in that area, but we either don't have access to the resources or are reluctant to seek out those resources. And then, like I said, the other area for me that I'm a staunch advocate for is the CTE world.
Okay, so there's so much I want to come back to in there, and I know we have like planned some things to talk about, so I don't want to take us too far off track. But I should mention, I think that's how we first met, was the computer related stuff, and probably a long time ago on social media, because that we have an overlap with the technology piece there. But
Yes.
I do want to make sure I very first hone in on, you're talking about it took you the last 20 years to really hone in on your mission, passion, and purpose. And I know that's kind of what we really want to focus on in this conversation. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how that has built into your work now? And maybe somehow I'll weave back in some of those questions I have about the other new stuff I just learned in the last few minutes.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So ultimately, I would say over the course of my classroom teaching career, I noticed a lot of things that are a byproduct of our systems that we have built in education. And I do want to stress to your audience that many of those systemic components are not restricted to the United States system. I've had the opportunity to do work in and advise ministries of education in other countries, quite a few other countries actually, and I see a consistency around that. I think a big byproduct of some of those systems can directly be traced to colonialism, but even within that, it basically boils down to me noticing the inequities that exist, the lack of access, the lack of diversity, and the lack of what I would identify as a truly inclusive educational experience. And that's where the international audience comes in, as far as when you're in your school, what access do students have to narratives that aren't within the scope of the quote unquote standard. And if you really start to interrogate the standards, if you will, you'll start to notice that they tend to highlight, perpetuate, and celebrate single stories, which usually are upper middle class and higher cisgender white males. And that's one of the things that I've noticed, that what that does to students in general is, if you aren't in that particular demographic, you begin to embody elements of inadequacy in yourself. And in many cases, and I know this to be true with a lot of my friends that work in education, you're not even until you're a middle-aged adult that you begin to develop an awareness around that. And then you've got to go through the self-care strategies of accepting who you are, being unapologetic for who you are, and then advocating for yourself, because think about what you've been exposed to up to that point. But then conversely to that, and I know this from my experiences in the classroom, I had lots of, I mean, my last school, the classroom, you could literally have sitting next to each other, one student where the household income is over $1 million sitting next to a student where the household income was less than 30,000 US dollars. And so ultimately, because it was a Title I school, but where it was located here in Los Angeles, it's near near more than about a half a dozen film and production studios. So you had families that worked in the industry, Hollywood industry, and then you had families who didn't. And then here's one, you had families whose parents cleaned the homes of those who worked in the industry. See, so you have this cycle here. But ultimately what I found, and this was probably after my third year at the school, is the more I exposed the students to narratives that were aligned with their cultural identity, as well as those that were not aligned with their cultural identity, it made for a much, much more cohesive and collaborative environment in the classroom. And I didn't know then what I know now. And again, for your listeners, it's critical that we demand that speakers, writers, and anyone cite their sources. So hopefully your listeners, and if they're not, are familiar with the concept of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And the whole idea around that is that every student's learning experience should serve as a mirror. I should see myself reflected in the curriculum, and it should be through an authentic voice and be an authentic representation of me, not someone else telling my story for me. Then in turn, you have the windows, which means that I should be exposed to a learning experience and narratives where I can look into the lives of those that I don't share the same cultural identity with, to get a better picture, or a clearer picture of what life is like through their lens. Obviously, that's my window. And then periodically, and ideally it happens often, the sliding glass door is I'm put in a position where I can step into their world and essentially get a deeper understanding of themselves. And I think ultimately those three components, especially the latter two, are a catalyst for really, really cohesive and meaningful collaborative environments because ultimately, if you can develop a cultural awareness and understanding of a classmate of yours, you're a lot more likely to have a deeper understanding of how they approach the work that you do in class. Which means in that context, which I noticed this from my classes, is the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. And every student is validated, which is being culture responsive. Every student's cultural identity is not only validated, but highlighted and encouraged. And by them being able to navigate those spaces that we have together in the classroom, knowing that you're going to be validated, celebrated, and your contributions are critical to overall group learning, essentially by your participation, it advances group learning in general.
And I think everything you're describing is something that, and I'm going to make a sweeping generalization here, that most international schools would say is something that is really strongly part of the core of their mission. But in the reality of what happens in schools, and I think this is, as relevant in international schools as it is in U.S. public schools or other state schools, is we're kind of going from a standardized curriculum that is written from one certain story and one certain lens. So what we're asking teachers and educators to do in what you're sharing here is really changing a lot of what they've been doing for most of their career.
Yes.
So how, if we're talking to educators, and I'm thinking of this through multiple lenses, if we're talking to educators who maybe this is new information to them, how do we help them kind of build that capacity? And then also a lot of people who listen to this podcast and watch this on YouTube are coaches. They might be working with educators who this concept is new, different, even potentially difficult for. How do you help them want to do this work and want to make these changes? Because ultimately, the expectation is not this right now. This is where we want things to go. So it really needs to be a little bit personally driven. How do we help people want to do this work?
Okay, perfect. So a couple of things. One, I have a whole process that I take school districts and school leadership through, which is examining habits of mind and cultural norms. And so ultimately, there might be the perception that you're doing the work, but until you are aware of and acknowledge that you have habits of mind that are sometimes a byproduct of your bias, then you're going to continue to operate from a myopic perspective on that. And until you get an outside, for the lack of a better term, outside perspective or evaluator, then you're never going to know those things. And so ultimately what I would say is it's safe to assume that you're not. Okay, it's safe to make that assumption. And what is required of educators, whether they're in the classroom, they're a coach, or a school leader, is the acknowledgement that there are gaps in providing that type of experience to our students. And in order to fill those gaps, we must first address them as the adults. And so there's many cases where I've talked with school leaders on this, as far as, if I were a student in your school, first of all, am I amongst the majority minority, or am I amongst the minority, at least isolated to your campus? Number one. Then number two, if I'm walking around your campus and I look at what you put up on the walls, how many representations am I going to see of myself? And then how many representations am I going to see of my classmates? And then are those representations authentic and in a positive capacity or positive light? So that's number one. Then when you go into looking at the curriculum, one of the questions I ask educators, and it's interesting because when I ask this question, it usually is the initial response is always laughter. But then people realize, no, I'm actually being serious. And I would say, if you know something you're doing has a high probability of causing harm to kids, would you still do it? And of course you get the laughter, and I'm like, no, that's a serious question. And of course they're like, well, no, that's crazy. And I'm like, then what would you say if I were to say to you that there may be something you're doing that actually does have a high probability of doing that? And then of course you get their interest. And then I go into like, okay, I'm going to give you an example. What kind of books do you assign in English classes? What kind of books are available in a library? When you're studying the maths and the sciences, which mathematicians historically and which scientists are you referring to in regards to the concepts that you're studying? What representation exists there? And so in turn, it's like, until you do a full examination and analysis of yourself and then the curriculum, you're highly likely perpetuating a myopic perspective on global life in general. And so, in terms of things like that, it does involve, examining your own biases, again, interrogating the curriculum, disrupting some of the norms that exist that have endured even all the way back to when I was in school in the mid 80s in high school. And, for the international school audience, you have to also be mindful of the fact that, I know of all the different, I mean, I don't know all of them, but I know all the different programs that are in place around, like, the IB program, and then there's Emilia Romagna, and there's all these other programs. And to me, it's like, those programs at face value may be good, but what you really want to do is look at what narratives and what type of learning experiences are consistent within those standards. And is there a chance that any one of those could easily, by design, without intent, but by design, marginalize any students on campus? Or here's a big one. For campuses that don't really have a whole lot of diversity, many international schools are designed so that students, when they graduate, they go to a university in the UK or the US. Many, not all. What is the likelihood that those students are going to set foot on any one of those campuses, whether in any of those countries, and feel a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion, and if they're part of the dominant culture, a sense that they can not only effectively navigate in, but contribute to spaces of which they are now no longer. They're in a multicultural classroom. And so that's why I mentioned the whole thing around, even causing harm, because any child that goes to a campus, a university campus, where they feel that they have to find their own little micro group and stay within that group, that theoretically means they were caused harm, because then they're choosing a form of self-isolation that ultimately is going to continue to perpetuate until they recognize that that is destructive to you as an individual, and it doesn't help you out by the time you graduate, whether you go work in a business world or anything else. What's the likelihood you're going to have interaction with someone who doesn't share your cultural identity? And then in turn, how are you going to react to that?
Thanks for watching today's episode. Don't forget to check out edurolearning.com for more great learning opportunities, and connect with us on social media at Eduro Learning to stay up to date with everything we share.